Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to our February lecture on the great books. I want to note that it's Valentine's today, and so I want to send love and blessings and an open heart to everyone on this call. I think that Valentine's is one of the most beautiful days because it's a day that's held sacred by many people around the world for an expression of love. We don't do that often enough. I think it's important to pause on days like this and just express love for one another. Love is what makes the world go round, and love is what endures over time. And there's a beautiful saying in the Tao Te Ching that I always remember around Valentine's and other times, that to love gives one courage, and to be loved gives one strength. Beautiful thing to contemplate on Valentine's. Today we're going to dive into the second half of the great play of Sophocles called the Antigone. And this, as I mentioned last month, is one of Sophocles' great plays. He wrote 3 plays around the mythological figure of Oedipus Rex. You remember that Oedipus was born the son of the king of Thebes, King Laius, and Queen Jocasta. And the prophet had told King Laius that his son was going to kill him. So when Oedipus was born, the king and queen had him exposed on the mountainside, and they tied his feet together by drilling little holes in his ankles, and they left him out on the mountain to die. And I mentioned the ankles because that's what Oedipus means, his ankles. And he was found by a shepherd. He was taken to Corinth, the nearby city-state in ancient Greece, and was brought into the palace of King Polybus and Queen Merone, and there he was raised as their son. And then he consulted, when he was 18, the Oracle of Delphi, and he was told that he was going to kill his father and marry his mother. And so, not wanting to do that, he fled Corinth for Thebes. And on his way to Thebes, he came to a place of the 3 corners where 3 roads meet. And there he refused to give way to a man in a chariot coming in the opposite direction. They got into a scuffle, and Oedipus killed him and made way to Thebes to find out that the king had been killed. And because Oedipus solved the mystery of the Sphinx, a monster, a she-monster that was threatening anybody who was coming into Thebes by answering a riddle, he was offered the kingship of Thebes and offered the former queen, his mother, as his wife. And acting in complete ignorance, he and Queen Jocasta were married. They had 3 children. and two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and a daughter, Antigone. A plague broke out many years later in Thebes, and the old prophet, blind prophet and poet, Tiresias, said that the plague would only be lifted if the murder of the previous king was solved. And to make a long story very short, by the end of the great play Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king, Oedipus finds out that he, in fact, was the one who had killed his father and married his mother and engaged in incest to produce three beautiful children. And in his remorse, he took the hairpins out of Jocasta's hair. She had hung herself, and plunged them through his eyes. And the man who had been given to see blinded himself. Not long after, his two sons came to an agreement that they would share the throne of Thebes. And 1 year, Eteocles would have it. 1 year, Polynices would have it. And that worked for a couple of years. And then it came to pass that 1 year, backed by Jocasta's brother, their uncle, Creon, Eteocles refused to give the throne to Polynices. And Polynices gathered 6 other warlords and attacked Thebes. There's another play called 7 Against Thebes. That's the story of the battle. And when it was all said and done, both brothers in personal combat lay dead on the field before the gates of Thebes. And Creon seized control of the city and declared that the body of Eteocles would be buried with honors, but the body of Polynices would not be buried and would be exposed to the birds to eat. So the play Antigone starts with her and her sister, Ismene. Oedipus had 2 boys and 2 girls. They're meeting in front of the gates. The battle has just happened. The body of Eteocles has been buried, and the body of Polynicus lies exposed before the gates of Thebes. And that's where the play begins. And it opens with Antigone, and as you all know by now, I like to get textual because that's where it really gets sublime. She says, "Ismene, my dear sister, all the evils that stem from Oedipus our father, that God does not bring to pass for us, what can we now expect? We are now faced with a proclamation made by the dictator, the tyrant, Creon, that the one brother is to be buried and the other brother is to be exposed. And she asks a beautiful, profound line that haunts all of us who deal with the mystery of evil. Don't you notice, my sister, when the evils due to enemies are headed towards those we love? This is the question of Job. When bad things happen to good people, what does that imply about justice? What does that imply about our actions? And the sisters begin to talk, and Ismene says, "Oh, Antigone, you're right, but you need to realize that we are only women, not meant in nature to fight against men, and that we are ruled by those who are stronger to obedience in this and even more painful matters. I shall yield in this to the authorities. Extravagant action defying Creon is not sensible." I want to just pause here for a moment to say the obvious that we all know, and it's been commented on by many, many commentators. There's a relationship between patriarchal power with regards to nature and patriarchal power in regards to women. And I want to just note this because there was few societies in the ancient world that were more exclusive around women than ancient Greece. One of the paradoxes. And the women were considered beautiful only if they were in the home, didn't speak very loudly, and tended to their knitting. And in fact, the women were limited to the home so assertively that women in ancient Athens had their own dialect. Think about that for a second. They had their own dialect. However, and this is seldom noted, but it's worth a comment in this case. And that is that throughout Greek literature, certainly in the great tragedies, women play powerful catalytic roles. One thinks of Antigone. One thinks of Clytemnestra in the Orestian trilogy, the wife and queen of King Agamemnon. One thinks of Medea. Greek literature is replete with strong women around which the entire plot revolves. And there's no woman in all of Greek literature that's stronger than Antigone. And let's just bear in mind, at this time in the play, she was a 14-year-old girl. She was a young teenager. And she sees the body of her brother and she says, "I will bury him. I will bury him. I shall be a criminal," she says, "but a religious one. The time in which I must please those that are dead is longer than I must please those of this world." So this is the first declaration. These words are the first declaration in extant literature of civil disobedience. And that's the first pause I want to make around our meta theme for today. And that the nature of civil disobedience is the willingness to commit a crime but to do it as an act of religious commitment. I shall be a criminal, but a religious one. So Ismene says, well, if you've got to do it, at least do not speak of this act to anyone else. Bury him in secret, she says. And what does Antigone says? Oh, no. I will shout it out. And that's another thing about civil disobedience. You not only break the law, but unlike every other crime, if you think of any other crime, people that steal, people that murder, people that do this, people do that, they're all trying to do it secretly so they don't get caught. But when it comes to civil disobedience, you do it publicly, and you fulfill that essential characteristic of civil disobedience that was articulated by Martin Luther King, that the purpose of civil disobedience, he said, is not to solve the problem. It's to call attention publicly to the fact that there is a problem. So when in the 1950s and the 1960s, the black people in Birmingham and Montgomery and Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus and refused to sit in the black-only parts of the restaurants and challenge the rules, they weren't trying to solve the problem. They were trying to call the attention to the problem, to activate the conscience of people of goodwill. So this notion of civil disobedience is a very important one in a time such as ours, where the balances are not correct. So that's how the play opens. And then enters Creon. After the two girls exit the stage, Creon comes in with the chorus and says, now here I am, holding all authority. It is impossible to know any man, I mean his soul, his intelligence, and his judgment, until he shows his skill in rule and law. I would not be silent if I saw ruin, not safety on the way towards my fellow citizens. It is our city that gives us security, and I will make our city even greater through law. Eteocles shall be buried. Polynices shall remain unburied. And the chorus says, O Creon, use any legal means that lie within your power, both about the dead and the living. So here you've got the dialectic. The young Antigone, compelled to bury her brother, and the king, Creon, stating that I have declared the law, and the law will not be violated. And they come together, but before they come together, I wanted to take a little sidebar note on the sentry that brings Antigone to Creon, because she's caught, because she does it very publicly, and she willingly submits to arrest. And the sentry brings her to Creon and said to Creon, we charged her, and she didn't deny a word of it, to my joy, but to my pain as well. And then he says, it is most pleasant to have escaped oneself out of such troubles, but painful to bring into it those whom we love. However, it is but natural for me to count all this less than my own escape. I want to dwell here for a minute, because this is the way most people deal with conflict of the conscience. They say, oh boy, I'm not going to deal with it. I know that Antigone's correct, he's basically saying, but I would have never done it. And the main thing is, I'm getting away. I'm going to be okay. How many of us, when come face to face with moral choice, try to stay on the sidelines and just watch the news on TV, not taking a stand, not making a difference? You know, the great lines of Martin Luther King, who's going to be my subtext here, is he said, you don't begin to live until you're willing to die for what you believe. And most of us are like the sentry. We're too afraid to ever make those kinds of choices. And therefore, we go through our entire life never living. So here comes Creon and Antigone. And the first thing that Antigone says to Creon, I did it. I will not deny it. And Creon says, and you dare disobey the law? Because he had decreed that whoever buried Polynices would be killed, would be executed. And then the famous lines of Antigone. Just think of a little young teenage girl defying an older man who's king. And she says, it was not God that made your proclamation, nor did justice. I did not believe your proclamation had power to enable one who will someday die to override the ordinance of God, unwritten and secure. The ordinances of God are not of today, Creon, and yesterday. They live forever. None knows when first they were. And of course, what she's saying is that the right of the family to bury the dead is a natural law greater than any ordinance of any king. And this is the crucial point at the heart of civil disobedience. When you come into a situation where the man-made law is in violation with natural law, with heaven's law, that contradiction forces one to choose. And again, just to go back to Martin Luther King, if you've read his letters from the Birmingham jail, where he was forced to spend significant amounts of time for his civil disobedience. He wrote a letter in which he asked the question, how do we determine the balance between natural law and man-made law? And he actually cited Aquinas, if you remember the great medieval Catholic theologian, Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century, where he said that there is natural law, God's law, and there's human law. And when the human law is in violation of natural law, we have an obligation to disobey it. Aquinas was actually quite radical. in his understanding of this, of the human responsibility and obligation when there's a contradiction between natural law and human law. And at this point, the chorus comes in and says, Antigone, you have a savage spirit of a savage father. You don't know how to yield to trouble, like your sister Ismene. You're not yielding here. And then Creon gives one of the most extraordinary statements on patriarchal misogyny in the Greek tragedies, where he says, this girl has learned her insolence before this, when she broke the established laws. But here is still another insolence, in that she boasts of it, laughs at what she did. I swear I am no man, and she's the man, if she can win this and not pay for it. So Creon is not only challenged by natural law and human law, he's challenged by a young woman. And he's saying, if I give in to this young woman, then she's the man and I'm the woman. And that is not going to happen. And moving along here. And then he makes the one of the most powerful statements about why law is so important. The man the city sets up in authority must be obeyed in small things and in just, but also in their opposites. This is crucial. Our civil authorities demand that we obey all laws, the just and the unjust. There is nothing worse than disobedience to authority. Disobedience destroys cities. Disobedience demolishes homes. It breaks and routs one's allies. Of successful lives, the most of them are saved by discipline. So we must stand on the side of what is orderly. We can't give victory to a woman. If we must accept defeat, let it be from a man. We must not let people say that a woman beat us. So just as he finishes this, his son Haman comes in. And it's a beautiful dialogue between the two of them, that Haman is secretly engaged to Antigone. And he tries to get his father to just relent. And Creon says, Haman, there are plenty of women out there that your manhood can plow. Don't worry about Antigone. And Haman goes out brokenhearted. And they condemn Antigone to be buried alive. So she's taken away to be buried alive. And then the chorus raises a point about the complexity of human affairs. You know, it seems pretty straightforward, but it really isn't. And the chorus says to Antigone, as she's being taken away to be buried alive, you went to the extreme of daring and against the high throne of justice, and you fell grievously, my daughter. But perhaps It was for some ordeal of your father that you are paying, not just you. Now, this is such a profound point that my words in the few minutes I have may not do it justice. But you know, there's an old saying coming out of the Torah that the sins of the father are visited unto the children, unto the seventh generation. Antigone was the result of incest. Her mother was her grandmother. And the sin of ignorance of Oedipus had a horrendous consequence. Even though he did the incest and killed his own father in complete ignorance, actually seeking to flee from any possibility of committing what the Oracle of Delphi said that he was condemned by prophecy to fulfill. How much of what Antigone was living out had nothing to do with her, but everything to do with the tragedy of her own father and family. You know, as we think about, if I think about my life, and all of us think about our lives, you know, how much of what we do is us, and how much of what we do is karmic residue from generations past, over which we have no responsibility, but from which we are the consequence. And that shapes our karmic destiny. And I just want to note that, and that's the genius of the Greek tragedians. This is why these plays like Sophocles, written 2,500 years ago, endure over time. And one of the final words of Antigone before she's sealed up is she says, "What law of God have I broken? Why should I still look to the gods in my misery?" Now take this in. This is Job. What laws of God have I broken? Why should I look to the gods in my misery? Because the gods have forsaken me. I was obeying the laws of God, and I'm being killed for it. Where is God? You know that very famous story from Elie Wiesel in Night. He's in Auschwitz. They're forced to witness the execution by hanging of 2 men and a young boy for stealing bread. And the men die quickly. The little boy is too light to hang himself, and he's jerking on the rope, spasming on the rope. And the entire camp, said Elie Wiesel, was transfixed in that moment. And behind him, a man moaned the question, "Where is God? Where is God?" And another man simply stated, "God is here. God is hanging on those gallows." Antigone appealed to God against God. Whom should I summon as ally? For indeed, because of piety, I was called impious. If this proceeding is good in the God's eyes, I shall know my sin. once I have suffered. But if Creon and his people are the wrongdoers, let their suffering be no worse than the injustice they are meting out to me. This is Job. And then her final words, she says, see what I suffer and who makes me suffer, because I gave reverence to what claims reverence. And then the chorus says, there is some terrible power in destiny, and neither wealth nor war, no tower nor black ships beaten by the sea can give escape from it. We're caught in our circumstances. We are the product of the loins of parents who committed acts of which we bear the responsibility of consequence. And in all these things, there is some terrible power in destiny, and neither wealth nor war nor tower nor black ships beaten by the sea can give escape from it. There was nothing that Antigone could have ever done to escape from the terrible choice of choosing whether to bury Polynices or not. That was her karma. And then she is buried. And then the blind poet Tiresias enters. Remember, he was the one who had told Oedipus the truth. And he was blind. And he comes in and challenges Creon. And he said to the king, I sat in my ancient place of divination for watching the birds. I heard an unwanted voice among them. The god of fire refused to burn the sacrifice, and from the thigh bones a dark stream of moisture oozed from the embers, smoked and sputters. The gall bladder burst, referring to the sacrifice that he had made as part of the divination. This is the city's sickness, and your plans, your violation of natural law is the cause of it. So the gods will not take our prayers or sacrifice, nor yet the flame from the thigh bones, and no bird cries shrill and clear. So glutted are they with the fat of the blood of the killed man. And then he makes this statement that is so beautifully profound. It encapsulates the entire complexio of the entire play. You must realize, he says to Creon, that you will not outlive many cycles more of this swift sun before you give in exchange one of your own loins bred, a corpse for a corpse. For you have thrust one that belongs above, below the earth. That was Polynices. And bitterly dishonored a living soul by lodging her in the grave, while one that belonged indeed in the underworld. Gods you have kept on this earth without due share of rites and burial, of due funeral offerings, a corpse unhallowed. So what was the crime of Creon? The dead body of Polynices, which should have been put under the earth. Creon dictated that it be kept above the earth. And Antigone, who should have been kept above the earth, he put below the earth. So he inverted the natural law purely out of his own arrogance and obsession with patriarchal power. These acts of yours are violence, and in requital, the avenging spirits of death itself and the gods' furies shall, after your deeds, lie in ambush for you, and in their hands you shall be taken cruelly. And to make the story short, because I want to deal with other things, but it's so beautiful. Tiresias is again prophetic. Haman dies, and the wife of Creon also dies. They commit suicide. When Haman sees where Antigone is bound up, and Creon comes back to Tiresias, completely shattered, that his entire family is dead, the city's in revolt, the gods will honor no sacrifice. And he says, what must I do then? Tell me, tell me. And the chorus says, the girl, you have to save the girl. Go now and bring her up from her cave. For the exposed dead man, Haman, Creon's son, give him a burial. So everything that Creon does was in relationship to the burying the dead. And who's supposed to be above the earth and who's supposed to be below the earth. That's natural law. And then I'll just close with the final lines of the play. Creon, because they go to save Antigone and she's dead too. And he says, lead me away, a vain and silly man who killed you, son, and you too, lady. I did not mean to, but I did. I do not know where to turn my eyes to look to for support. Everything in my hands is crossed. A most unwelcome fate has leaped upon me. You notice his final words were about his eyes. Oedipus, his brother-in-law, could see, and yet he was blind to the reality that he was going to kill his father and marry his mother. At the point where he saw the enormity of what he had done, he pierced out his eyes and was blind. Creon thought he saw, but was blind. That's worth contemplating. We think we see, but we very seldom actually perceive the reality. And some of the greatest crimes are done by people thinking they're the most clear. And in their arrogance of thinking they know, they violate the laws of eternity. And thus the chorus in the closing lines of the play says, wisdom is far the chief element in happiness. And secondly, no irreverence toward the gods, but great words of proud men exact in retribution blows as great, and in old age teach wisdom. Let's just unpack this for a moment. Wisdom is far the chief element in happiness. What is wisdom in the end? Wisdom is that capacity to know your place, not as the center, but as part of a larger whole. And within the context of knowing one's place. Know thyself, said the Oracle of Delphi. That's what leads to happiness. And the other part of wisdom, said the chorus, never show irreverence to the gods. Never violate natural law. But the great words of haughty men, proud men, hubris. This is the sin of hubris. And when you succumb to pride, you exact a retribution as great as your hubris. And in your old age, you will learn wisdom. Creon was the only one left standing at the end of the play. And having lost all, he became wise. And I come back time and time again to those immortal words of Aeschylus. Drop by drop, pain that cannot forget falls upon the heart, until in our despair, against our will, Creon fought the obvious to the bitter end, comes wisdom by the awful grace of God. So we come now to 2017 and Trump's America. We have a president that is violating just about every natural law conceivable. There's not time to go into detail, but I just want to touch on his major crimes. The first was how he got elected president. Just last night, we had the resignation of Michael Flynn, his national security advisor, because he was engaging in illegal activity discussing the lifting of the sanctions with the Russians before the elections and before he was duly appointed. He's now been forced to resign. And the question is, what did Trump know and when did he know it? Our intelligence agencies have stated categorically that the Russians manipulated the 2016 presidential election. There's mounting evidence that Donald Trump not only knew about it, but colluded with them. That's treason. That's of crime against the American people and a crime against our Constitution. When an individual conspires and colludes with a foreign power to manipulate the due process and constitutionally guaranteed rights of one's own country. One thinks of Benedict Arnold in the American Revolution. He colluded with the British and was executed. And Trump engaged in treason to obtain the presidency. Now, the reason why these sanctions are so important, because the greater crime is yet to be done. And this is why we all need to be Antigone. The greater crime is to lift the sanctions and allow ExxonMobil the former CEO of which is now the Secretary of State of the United States, to engage in the most massive drilling for oil in the Arctic. ExxonMobil has 63.7 million acres of leased land in the Arctic, and an agreement with Rosneft, the big Russian oil company, to drill. It'll be the largest oil deal in the history of oil, one of the largest economic deals, business deals in the history of economics, worth trillions of dollars. So this is why the Russians were so keen on getting Hillary out of the running. They engaged in hacking, they engaged in election fraud, they engaged in manipulation of the media, and Trump was in on it. That's getting increasingly clear. And they're preparing to engage in even a greater crime. I don't think anybody on this phone call or lecture needs to be told about climate change and the fragility of the Arctic ecosystem in relationship to climate change. We unleash ExxonMobil and Rostel into the Arctic, and we're going to take climate change beyond any retrievability. And that will endanger humanity and our civilization in ways that are literally incalculable. Creon only decreed that one body not be buried. Trump is engaging in activities that are perverting the constitution of an entire nation, and now plans at a moment when all oil needs to stay in the ground. Think about this. What was the crime of Creon? The body, the dead body above the ground that should have been taken under the ground was not. The woman who was alive above the ground and should have stayed above the ground was buried alive. What is Trump doing? Oil, which needs now to stay under the ground, he wants to bring out of the ground. That's the crime. That's the violation of natural law. And we are all Antigone. Every one of us is Antigone. And no matter where you are, no matter who you voted for, no matter what your politics, we're now being confronted by what I call our Hitler moment, where if we don't stop this guy from committing this crime against humanity, against the future, against civilization itself, we are complicit in what he does. And it's a Hitler moment because the consequences of what he's going to do are going to be completely devastating for everyone. This is not an ordinary crime. This is a crime against humanity. And so as we contemplate this young girl and taking on Creon, all of us in this time of Trump need to imbibe of that spirit and to commit, if necessary, criminal acts of civil disobedience publicly and in the spirit of truth. And one of the most extraordinarily heartful things I think that is happening in the world today is every move that Trump makes is being countered. And all of us need to think about how we continue to understand what's happening, participate in what's happening, and to take our stands. So I'll leave it there. I could go into a lot more detail, but I hope that you've seen in the course of this lecture the power of natural law. It undergirds everything. And our obligation as moral beings is to understand first the natural law and align every thought, every word, every deed in our lives with that natural law. And when it's violated, particularly at a massive level, like with Creon and now with Trump, all of us have to realize that we need not only to understand the violation, we are called upon by the gods themselves to take a stand against it. And therein lies our immortality. So with that, I'll open it up, Mark. You no doubt have a different point of view. I hope so. And then we'll call on Georgie, and then we'll open it up to the students.
I guess the different point of view is why you keep tolerating me here, Jim. Well, thank you for the presentation and the parallels that you draw are very powerful. And nothing I'm about to say, as is indicated, should imply fundamental disagreement, but there's, there may be questions of degree and tone that we differ on. So let me go leave aside the Trump analysis for now and go back to the play. The reading that you've given us is largely assumes that, although there were things you said that maybe nuance that quite a bit, but that Antigone's position is basically flawless. That's what we should admire. Creon's hubris is what brings about the downfall, or his failure to follow the natural law, as you say, and then his hubris in defending his position is what brings about the crash. But of course, nothing comes out too well in this play, other than Creon's wisdom at the end, as you pointed out. And let me pick up on some remarks you made at the very end. You said that we think we see, but we seldom perceive the reality. The arrogance is in thinking that we know, and wisdom is primary, and wisdom is the capacity to know your place in the larger whole and to have a handle on your own hubris, essentially. And that's the insight that Creon comes to at the end. But there is a reading of this play, it's not original to me, that doesn't see Antigone's position as so flawless, that she has her own brand of hubris that contributes to the overall tragedy for the entire society. She speaks for the gods, she thinks, but then, of course, the postmodern issue is, how do you know? How do you really know that your truth is the absolute truth? And Creon, too, initially thinks that he speaks for the gods. That's on in my edition here. I have a different translation than yours, but he objects to the notion that the gods would allow the wicked to prevail, as in his view, because there is some truth, even I think within the confines of the play, to the fact that he is speaking for the social order and doesn't want it to break down. So the chorus many times accuses Antigone of a kind of self-righteousness because she sees no limitation in her own judgment. She thinks she's possessed of the absolute truth. And even, looking at burial practices, I mean, they vary widely across the world from culture to culture. So it may not be such an absolute truth as in the defense of the specific burial practices of Greek society at this time. It may not be entirely a law of nature. For the Tibetans, it's not so bad in sky burials that the birds consume the body. So when she has this sense of her own self-righteousness and absolute truth, as a result, she really doesn't engage in dialogue. Creon proves in the end that he is capable of change. He is capable of seeing the deeper wisdom, ultimately. But Antigone, in a sense, doesn't give him that chance. And there's numbers of references, as you pointed out, to her repeating the probably hubris, but in some more slightly vaguer way, the sins of her father. And she has it's explicitly said she has his stubbornness. The stubbornness is what she's accused of from time to time. A sense of martyrdom and in isolation of herself out of her own pride. And so that too, it might be, plays ultimately a role in the overall violations of wisdom that are played out here. It's not only Creon's villainy that's the cause of the downfall of the whole family and presumably of the society, which I suppose doesn't fare too well at the end either. At the end, Tiresias says something to, let me see if I give it to you in my translation, that all men are liable to error. That would include Antigone as well. And that all men, both great and small, are liable to error, but he who errs no more unfortunate or all unwise shall be if having tripped he rights his wrong nor stubbornly persists. So humans are capable of reversing direction, and the failure in wisdom in Antigone's part by this reading is that she doesn't, she immediately sets up this opposition which contributes to driving Creon, who is salvageable, into a harder and harder position. And it's by taking an extreme, I think the word that's used here is overweening position, that she doesn't allow a kind of societal discussion that could bring things to a better place. So wisdom is in the end, Tiresias says, prudence is the best of all our wealth. And wisdom in the end is, I think, in a remark of the chorus, it's an avoidance of overweening. So I just throw that position out as an alternative interpretation of the play and of Antigone's role, which no doubt you have comments about.
That's why I love you, Mark. You're always so good and so elegant. And you're right, you're pointing to something very profound. You know, it was Sophocles that is really responsible for the development of what we know today as the tragic hero. With Aeschylus and with Euripides, the other two great tragedians, their plays are more complex and nuanced in some ways. It was Sophocles that developed this notion of the tragic hero, the person who, unbending, is destroyed by fate precisely because they can't bend, refuse to bend.
And may I just point out that the play is named Antigone. It's not named Creon.
Yeah.
So in some sense she may be displaying those same failings.
Yeah. Yeah, and in that sense, that you're right. The chorus says you're acting just like your father, because remember, through the play Oedipus Rex, which I'll go into one of these years. People keep saying to Oedipus, "Listen, you don't want to know. Trust us." And when Jocasta understands before he does, she says, "Honey, stop. You don't want to know." And it was his refusal to stop, his refusal to stop at anything other than the total truth that destroyed him. And the same thing is true of Antigone. She took a hard position, refused to budge, and was destroyed by it. And I didn't read, but it's to your point, Creon says to her, "It is the toughest iron, baked in the fire to hardness. You see most shattered, twisted, and shivered into fragments."
Yeah.
And you see this in Ajax, and you see this in almost all of the Sophoclean tragedies, at least that we have. You know, he wrote 123, and he placed first or second in I think 80 or 90 of those, and we only have something like 8 of his plays. So it's hard to generalize, but as a general statement, the point that you're making is essentially correct. And that's the hubris that all of us have to contend with. You know, and you're right, Creon in the end, destroyed, finally sees. So that's another paradox of life and circumstance. The hero, the heroine in this case, unbending, dies. The one who had perpetrated the original crime, having been stripped like Job down to just himself, finally sees. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. Georgie.
Hey, thank you so much. Well, thank you, Jim, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Well, you just brought the whole story alive, and if you ever look for a part-time job as an actor, you could do well. Maybe not in Hollywood, but maybe in Greece, I don't know. But just before I would like to have a few questions from you, but before I ask those questions with regard to seeing, didn't the Little Prince's creator Antoine Saint-Exupéry said that we see with our heart? So Creon didn't see with his heart, did he? So my first question to you, dear Jim, is about Antigone's will to bury her brother. Was it, you think, based on rational thought or instinct? I know you use different words, and I intentionally use different words. Do you think it was rationally decided, instinctually, or both?
I would say instinctive. I think this was an innate, intuitive knowing that was so incontrovertible that the rationality of Ismene, her sister, were only women, he's the king, you got to obey the law, all those rationalizations were not sufficient for her to violate her own intuitive understanding of a deeper truth. That would be my take. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. But would you say actually that when we talk about the natural law and the human law, that we said that human law is created by humans, but the natural law, that is the the translation, human translation. So that could be very subjective too. So I'm not actually going against Antigone because I'm for her, but just to be the devil's advocate, that if you say that, you know, she was acting towards or according to her instinct, then could our instinct be right and to the collective good, or was it just a very selfish decision?
Well, no, I think they're back to Aquinas, right? And the Buddhist notion of natural law, Taoist notion. The assertion is that because we are nature, we know nature. And that's the basis of intuition, that's the basis of conscience. And we all wrestle with it in our own lives. We know what we should be doing, but we don't do it. We rationalize ourselves away from that which we most deeply know. And I think Socrates, most mystics and theologians would say that what unites humanity as one is our collective capacity to know what the truth is. It's that we violate what we know that creates, as it did for Creon, a tragedy. But that's a debatable point. I mean, Mark was making the point, we know we need to bury, but the different cultures do it in a different way. And that's what I would say would be the natural law, Mark, is we all know the dead need to be honored in some way. However we do that, that's the differentiation of culture. But that we need to honor the dead is something we all intuitively know to be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that knowing that empowered Antigone to be strong. And in this point, I don't want to push it too much, but I would say that the strength and certitude that comes from knowing is different than the strength and certitude that comes from man-made law, rationalization. The one is an act of humility, not my will but thine be done. The other one is an act of hubris, not thy will but mine be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, as you said, we could actually go much deeper. It is about the definition of good, definition of value. I would say the definition is good is not just for Antigone, that was her subjective point of view that she wanted to bury her brother, but also that was in accordance with the law, the divine law. Whereas Creon was its all his egoistic view that this has to be my way or just you die. Now, my second question is, Jim, that you said that we are all Antigones and you are Antigone in Emma's body. What would you do differently than she has done in our day and age, not there and then?
Well, I think I'm inspired by Antigone because she understood the natural law and was willing to stand for it. And I think that would be what we need to be doing with regards to Trump, for example. Obviously, we would work differently. The issue isn't burial of a brother. The issue is how do we keep the oil in the ground, keep what is buried. So in that sense, our challenge is the inversion of hers. Obviously, this is a global enterprise. But I think what is common is she realized, unlike Ismene in the century, that this called her to respond with a total act of being for which she was willing to sacrifice her life. And I think we've come to that moment with Trump. We need to understand that if we don't stop this guy, he's going to destroy the world as we know it. And what is so inspiring to me is you see the archetype of Antigone bursting out all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what was the most, and since I've been preparing this lecture, right, I've been thinking about it. But remember when he came out of with his immigration ban, within minutes, they had shut down LA Airport and JFK. I talked to people, I was just in LA, I talked to people that told me that people they didn't even know kind of came out of their seats, as it were, drove down to the airport and did something they'd never done in their lives.
Yeah, and in that, on that, actually, I would like to offer a contribution and then pass it on to our listeners. One of my greatest hero is the 17th Karmapa, and the future is now. And in this, I read something, many important messages, and this one really tells with what you said. He says, get involved as best you can. Try to encourage the good in others and discourage the bad. Don't be indifferent. If you are not able to respond to people's behavior directly, then reckon how to do so in the future. Wait for the right moment. Even if you never have the chance to respond, take stock of what is positive and what is negative. If someone performs a mix of good and bad deeds, respond in whatever way seems most appropriate at the time.
Karmapa has it.
Could I may interject just a quick comment here, and then
please, and then we're going to go to the students. So you
yes.
students out there, get ready for your comments. No neutral ground on this one.
I'll be very brief. That's a lovely quotation, Georgie, and I think it's very relevant to the point I'd like to make, and that is that even when you feel that you know nature, it's a genuine question about the best way to bring about compliance with the natural law. That's a genuine dilemma.
Yeah.
The order of the city in this play, in the society, is also part of the natural law. It's what the gods seem to want. And the Karmapa there says, encourage the good in others and wait for the right moment, so that the practical actions called for at a given moment, even if you agree upon the goal, is not necessarily self-evident.
Yeah.
You
know, and I think you're right, Mark, and that's the importance of community and dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's why I so appreciate you on these calls, and Georgie. You know, we know, but our expressions of what we know is determined by the finiteness of our condition and our situation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we need communities. We're always needing to be checking in with people and testing what we know with people we love and trust.
Right.
It's out of that collective discernment that I think we're all empowered, both in our humility, but also in our certainties.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So absolutely. So, okay, everyone, I see Bodie and Dave and Dawn and Frederica, Michelle, Paul, Roderick, Rod, and Sandy. So who wants to make the first contribution? I don't know. I guess you, what do you do again, Dan?
Dave knows he raised his hand, and he'll show up in just a moment.
Oh, here. Oh, there we go. I see his hand.
I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely fascinating discussion with its complexity and its multivariant processes. I don't have as you know, I think very slowly, and it'll be probably several days before I come to, really good conclusions. But two things stand out for me at the present time. One is a statement from Carlos Castaneda that a warrior stands in the middle of the road waiting. And it seems to me that that is the stance that is required that to really clearly define how one can act and then do so in a fashion that you are waiting for a community to respond. For me, the major struggle has been that of wanting to contribute, but yet getting easily exhausted by the complexity and the discordance and the many interpretations. One of the most interesting books I've read recently has been that of Don't Even Think About It by George Marshall, in which he presents his research in terms of the multiple ways in which people avoid the issue of climate change. And in the one in which that I want to focus on in particular is the one that you just mentioned, Jim, that find a community that you trust. And it seems to me that that is a two-edged sword, that if your community you trust is very mature, it's a wonderful place. But if the community that you trust simply reinforces your own hubris, it's a major danger. And for me, the Tea Party and other aspects of the world discussion have been places in which people have inappropriately used trust as a way to justify their own stances.
Well, I think, Dave, thank you for raising this point because I think it's crucial. And one of the tragedies of the Trump administration is he's bringing in extremists, and there's not enough differentiation of opinions and points of view.
Yep.
And I think you can get yourself in a community, and then all of a sudden you're all taking the Kool-Aid, right? And you're all talking yourself into going off the cliff. And I think this is important, and this is one reason, coming back to Mark on Valentine's, I've always loved Mark because we always seem to disagree. And I just love that. But in the spirit of academic integrity and Georgie too, she asks good questions, she has different points of view, you've always had a good, and I think that's the kind of community that had Antigone had, and had been able to sort of to envelop the Antigone and the Creons in that situation, there may have been a more holistic therapeutic outcome.
Right.
And oftentimes in the absence of that kind of mature community, we get caught up in the storyline in our own head, and we end up meeting fire with fire, but none is correct when what we really needed was drops of water.
Absolutely.
So I really want to honor that, and that's a very important refinement to the kind of community that we seek to cultivate at Ubiquity.
Yeah, just to add to that, I forget the actual reference, but one of the sources in my dissertation noted that wisdom basically comes in two fashions. Children have an incredible wisdom, and certainly Antigone is drawing upon that wisdom. But there's an additional component that comes with age and experience. And it is the twofold combination of that wisdom that then I think allows the best possible outcome. I certainly, in terms of this discussion, am favoring, or at least I had come to the similar conclusions as Mark, in terms of Antigone having a wisdom, but also being a self-righteous teenager.
Well put. Well put. You know, what is it they say? If you're not a radical when you're young, there's something wrong with your heart, and if you're not conservative when you're old, there's something wrong with your head. Okay, Dawn, you have your hand up. I love to see these little hands. Dawn, please.
So good to see you. Can you hear me?
There we go. Hi, Dawn.
Hi.
Are you in Colombia?
I am in Colombia.
My goodness.
High in the mountains of the Andes in Colombia. It's great. And it makes me feel, as I've watched this drama play out over the last few months, kind of like the Greek chorus. I'm not on the front lines. I'm up in the mountains watching it happen. So it's a very interesting place to be. As I read Antigone, one of the things that really struck me, the parallels, is how the naming of the disempowerment of women and Antigone's conclusion after the naming of her disempowerment is, I have to do what I have to do. I am impelled to do this, even though I am a woman and I am disempowered. And she stepped outside of that naming and really expressed her own power in that. For me, it didn't matter whether she was a teenager or not. In fact, in some ways, teenage girls can speak truth to power in ways that no one else can. But that's exactly, I feel like, what happened over, like with the Women's March and all the people that just rose up, all the women and the men who supported the women, that I kept hearing this naming of disempowerment, and yet it still happened. That huge, huge protest spoke truth to power in a way that no one surrounding this administration is able to. So I'm really quite, even though I'm the Greek chorus up in the mountains, I'm really pleased to see how people are going beyond the disempowerment and trying to make a difference. It's heartwarming to me.
Yeah, well, thank you. By the way, I forget the name of your partner.
Bailey.
Bailey. Well, I just want to make hey, Bailey.
Hi, Jim.
Come over, put your face in the picture. I want to make a comment.
She's been out gardening, so she's not feeling like she's at her best right now.
Oh, well, I'm sure any state of Bailey's at her best. I wanted to just make a middle note and send both of you so much love for Valentine's, and tell the group they were part of a journey we had to Greece. And we ended up at Delphi. And the last evening, we dedicated the entire final meal to Plato's Symposium, which is a discussion of love. And we did it in honor of Dawn and Bailey, whose love during the trip was so exquisitely sublime that I thought the only way to bring this journey to a close was to do it in the spirit of the symposium. And so happy Valentine's to both of you.
Thank you so much. And let me just say, here's Bailey. Let me just say that
there we go.
Every day is a Valentine's Day with my love. So, yeah.
Beautiful. The only other comment, and I know we're out of time, but just to say, you even though you're in Colombia, you can't act like the sentry. You can write your congressman.
Yes.
You can write all the senators. You can call the Capitol in Washington. I forget what the number is. They'll put you right through to your representative, your senator. And the more we can all be doing it day by day, outrage by outrage at every level. So even if you're as far away as Colombia, you can participate. You can be Antigone. Okay, everyone. Well, listen, this has been a wonderful, wonderful dialogue. I love it that we're celebrating the courage of a young woman on Valentine's as we take on the enormity of Trump. I believe it is this spirit that is going to bring him down. And so I want to honor that as we close. And all of us aspiring to be Antigone under current circumstances is a high honor. A high honor. Thank you all. Happy Valentine's.